Um, so I'm honored to share work that has grown out of my PhD and is going to form the core, of the book project that I'm working on. So my work today comes from a simple but deeply political question. And the question is, how do people remember their past when the institutions meant to preserve memory are fragile, they're fragmented, or have been shaped by colonial power? And in Nigeria, as in many parts of the global south, this question cannot be answered by looking only at state archives, school curricula, or official monuments. We have to look at cinema. And my central argument, oh, sorry, for 1 minute, yeah. How do people remember their past when the institutions meant to preserve memory are fragile, fragmented, or have been shaped by colonial power? Yeah. So in Nigeria, as in many parts of the global south, this question cannot be answered by looking only at state archives, school curricula, or official monuments. We also have to look at cinema. And my central argument is that in Nigeria, historical cinema is not just a representation of the past. It has become one of the main sites where ordinary people encounter, negotiate, and emotionally process national history, especially under conditions of archival weakness and infrastructural scarcity. And the argument sits in quiet resonance with Rodney's thinking. I'm happy to be here, like I said. So, which makes this occasion particularly meaningful. I engage Rodney not to refocus the paper on him, but because his work offers a valuable sensibility, a way of noticing how power, material realities, and cultural labor shape what stories can be told. His insights form a subtle orientation into the background, while the analysis itself remains firmly centered on cinema. So what I take from Rodney is less a formal framework, but more a set of instincts. That history is always mediated, that material conditions shape visibility and silence, and that everyday people sit at the core of historical experience. That narrative, that narratives emerge within structures of power, and that cultural work itself is political labor. So these impulses help illuminate why in Nigeria, film often becomes the earliest and most enduring point of contact with the past, long before textbook museums or state archives enter the picture. So my project brings together textual analysis of Nigerian historical films, coupled with ethnographic insights from interviews and production observations, as well as theoretical framing from memory studies, African cinema, and media infrastructural studies. So I've also found a need to incorporate audience research in order to triangulate these textual and production-based insights. So the core claim is that Nigerian historical cinema is constitutive rather than merely representational. It actively produces memory, reorganizes heritage, mediates trauma, and fills the gap left by fragile or inaccessible archives. So this is especially visible in films like Invasion 1897, which was directed by Lancelot Imasuen, October 1, which was directed by Kunle Afolayan. Both films were made in 2014, and 76 by Izu Ojukwu, made in 2016. This will be my main case studies. And okay, so these films work under real constraints, and some of these constraints are unreliable electricity, generator noise embedded in soundscapes, scarcity of period props and costume, poor funding, changing location, permission and informal negotiations, as well as political sensitivities about colonialism, independence, and military rule. So in this context, filmmakers are not just storytellers, they are doing the work of public historians, informal archivists, cultural critics, and emotional translators of the past. So the key idea I want to develop, and partly in conversation with Brian Larkin, is that in this space, scarcity itself becomes a visual language constraint becomes authorship, and improvisation becomes a historiographic method. So I want to begin with 3 brief stories that show how cinema functions as everyday historiography. Now, these stories show how film both subtly and actively reshape how people think or what people think they know about the past. They illustrate how everyday viewers pick up historical meaning from screen culture, often without realizing it. Now, the first story is the story of Efonshetan Aniwura, when a dramatic character becomes a real person. Efonshetan Aniwura appears in Yoruba history as a powerful 19th century merchant and political figure. But what most Nigeria recognize today is the version created by Akinwumi Ishola in 1976. That's of a tragic, severe woman whose downfall is framed as moral failure. That dramatized version became the dominant public image. During debates about her statue in Ibadan, the arguments people made came almost entirely from the play and the film, not from historical scholarship. Now, the second story is Oleku, when film brings a time period back to life. So Tunde Kelani's Oleku doesn't just evoke the 1970s Ibadan. It brings its textures back to circulation through clothing, music, speech, campus life, and gestures. The film reintroduced an aesthetic that modernization outlawed. The famous example is fashion. The Oleku buba and the mini iro, which had faded from the fashion scene, suddenly made its way back amongst the young women. And so here, film didn't just portray the atmosphere, it revived it. It showed how cinema can re-energize cultural styles and practices. And then the third story is that of the Igwe trope, when screen convention shapes social assumptions. So historically, most Igbo societies were acephalous, organized around decentralized decision-making, and scholars have consistently noted that large-scale kingship structures were rare. Yet Nollywood repeatedly builds Igbo stories around monarchies, headed by Igwe. If you've watched any Nollywood film, those historical films, you hear Igwe. So over time, this visual pattern shaped people's expectations. The clearest example is the Igwe of the Igbos in Ghana. That's the guy in the center. This is a self-appointed title that resonated because viewers were already familiar with that worldview from film. So this is a screen convention that has become a social script. And here, cinematic language subtly shaped how people imagine political order. So why do these stories matter? Now, these stories show that people often take cues from film when forming ideas about the past. And emotion, style, and repetition give screen culture unusually strong influence. Then film can reinforce familiar narratives or sometimes trouble them. Also, historical understanding shifts as cultural forms reinterpret people, periods, and practices. Now, with these stories in place, we can now move into the theoretical tools that explain how Nigerian cinema takes place on this interpretative role. The theoretical frameworks looking at how real history produces memory. To understand why Nigerian historical cinema has become a central site of memory making, this section draws on 3 intersecting bodies of theory. The first is the collective memory studies of Hallbergs and Assmann. The second is the frame theory of Batson, Goffman, and Eitzmann. And the fourth is the media infrastructural theory of Brian Larkin. Together, they illuminate how film actively shapes how the past is organized, felt, and debated. First, the collective memory theory of Hallbergs and Assmann. Now, Maurice Hallbergs argues that memory is never private. It is produced within social groups through shared narratives, image, and interpretative cues. Lydia Assmann extends this by distinguishing between the communicative memory, which is fluid, everyday remembering that circulates across generations and has a time frame of about 80 to 100 years, and the cultural memory, which is more stabilized, enduring, enduring representation held in media, symbols, and pattern storytelling. So the relevance here is that historical films supply a set of visual and emotional references through which Nigerian audiences imagine key periods. So we can say that the Benin's encounter with Britain is visualized through Invasion 1897. Independence is emotionally patterned after October 1, and the cool era is often pictured through intimate tensions shown in 76. So cinema provides widely legible references or reference points that shape how different communities recall or debate the past. Going to frame theory of Barton, Goffman, and Ettman, frame theory explains how meaning is structured, what becomes visible, what fades into the background, and what emotional or moral cues audiences are encouraged to take up. So frame shapes the focus, the tone, the narrative emphasis, and the affective responses. So in Nigerian historical cinema, we can say that Invasion 1897 frames colonial intervention as predatory rather than civilizing. We can say that October 1 frames independence as a moment of psychic uncertainty, while 76 frames military rule through domestic life rather than state institutions. So these films do not simply recount events, they provide interpretative templates for understanding them. And cinematic framing becomes a cognitive and affective guide for making sense of historical experience. Now, the third framework is the media infrastructural theory, Larkin and the poetics of scarcity. Brian Larkin's work shows how the material conditions of media production, some of which I've listed earlier, the interrupted power, the improvisation, the uneven access to technology, how they shape not only the technical outcomes, but the narrative and aesthetic form. So when this is applied to historical cinema, material unpredictability generates creative strategies such as stylization, expressive lighting, and choreographed moments in Invasion 1897, substitution, the imported period objects in October 1, and implication and interiority, the off-screen cues and emotional focus in 76. Here, production conditions influence the emotional and visual shape of historical storytelling. Constraint becomes a structural principle, not foregrounded as deficiency, but as a condition that guides how history is visually and affectively assembled. So why these three frameworks matter together? Collective memory theory explains how shared images circulate. Frame theory shows how meaning and emotions are organized, while media infrastructural theory clarifies why these images take the form that they do. So together they show that Nigerian historical cinema does more than portray the past. It constructs interpretative environments through which audiences negotiate meaning, emotion, and historical possibility. Now I'll quickly go to Nigerian's production ecology, constraint as method. Nigerian historical cinema emerges in a production landscape marked by structural fragility rather than abundance. Now, building on Larkin, I treat this condition not as a background noise, but as part of authorship of the films. Material realities shape what history can look and feel like on screen. And I'll look at about 6 frameworks. The first one is structural realities. Filmmakers work through chronic constraints, but these are not occasional inconveniences, but the ground on which the historical storytelling is built. Now, constraint becomes the authorship. In this context, constraint does not simply limit historical cinema, it organizes it. It shapes narrative choices, means on scene, emotional tone, and even what is thinkable as history on screen. These strategies are especially visible: stylization, substitution, and improvisation under pressure. Stylization as a visual rhetoric of loss. Because many of these historical subjects and spaces are missing or inaccessible, the filmmakers then lean into stylization. In Invasion 1897, the absence of original bronzes induces this stylization through, like I said, warm symbolic lighting, choreographed movements, stylized sets, rhythmic soundscapes. So the stylization here is not cosmetic. It signals what has been taken or lost. The missing object becomes part of meaning. Substitution as commentary. For October 1, Kunle Afolayan struggled, according to what he told me, he struggled to source so many of the props he had to buy from Amazon. And so they were imported. So this production workload doubles as commentary. The film quietly exposes how little of Nigerians' everyday material past has been preserved, especially by institutions. So substitution then becomes critique. We also have censorship fear and the emotional turn. In 76, political sensitivities around the military shaped aesthetic decisions. So Izu Ojukwu avoids graphic spectacle and instead relies on domestic scenes, off-screen, sound, women's conversation, and performances. Violence is implied rather than shown. The result is an emotional archive of fear, suspicion, and strain rather than a straightforward chronicle of coups and decrees. And then finally, we have improvisation as vernacular historiography. So, a situation where the former records are thin, filmmakers depend on oral testimonies, elders' recollections, community memory, family photo albums, scattered documents, and creative reconstruction from their imagination. Improvisation becomes a way of doing history from below, assembling the parts from fragments rather than that circulate outside of official channels. So when we take all these six together, these practices show that what audiences remember is shaped by what filmmakers can materially reconstruct. And absence itself becomes narratively legible through stylization, substitution, and implication. And the look and feel of Nigerian historical film arise from conditions of fragility, resilience, and improvisation. Especially resilience. Nollywood grew from the ground up with very little government support, and these filmmakers bent, double just to make sure that things get working. So this allows us to see Nigerian historical cinema not as a failed imitation of better resource traditions, such as Hollywood, but as a distinct epistemic practice, a way of making history under pressure. So I'll quickly look at the case studies. Nigerian historical cinema makes the past accessible by transforming fragments of memory, material scarcity, and political sensitivity into narrative and aesthetic form. So the three films that I've examined, Invasion 1897, October 1, and 76, offer different models of how filmmakers reconstruct historical experience when the resources for conventional historiography are uneven. Each film creates its own way of entering the past, revealing how memory work unfolds through mediation rather than through direct recall. So the first case study is Invasion 1897, anti-colonial cinema as counter-archive. So Lancelot Odua Imaswen's Invasion 1897 staged an explicit challenge to the colonial accounts that framed the Benin Kingdom as barbaric, and thereby justified British intervention. The film reconstructs Benin as orderly, ceremonially rich, and politically complex, countering the textual legacies of figures such as Alan Boisragon in 1897, as well as the British Foreign Office reports. This reframing is not merely representational, it functions as an argument about perspective and authority. The film's contemporary courtroom framing device underscores this intervention. By situating the narrative within a legative dispute over looted bronzes, Imaswen linked 1897 to ongoing debates about restitution and the power of Western museums. And some of these conversations have been productive. We found some of the looted bronzes have been returned. The courtroom becomes a discursive space where alternative historical claims can be voiced, operating as a counter-archive that challenges the institutional narratives that have long dominated the story. So material constraints shape the film's visual world. Without access to the original palace architecture, the bronzes or period regalia, The filmmakers just turned to stylized sets, symbolic lighting, choreographed movements, and spiritually inflected sound. These choices foreground what is missing, what was destroyed, stolen, or rendered inaccessible. So the stylization here is not a decoration, it becomes a visual register of loss and dispossession. So for many viewers, Invasion 1897 offers a visceral entry point into a historical episode that might otherwise remain abstract. So the film travels where monograph museum galleries or archival collections may not, contributing images and emotions that circulate in everyday conversations and informal learning spaces. So in this way, the film participates in shaping the landscape of public historical imagination. The second case study is October 1, like I said earlier, and I'm looking at independence as ambivalent transition. So Kunle Afolayan's October 1 approaches the moment of independence through an atmosphere of unease. Rather than presenting 1960 as a straightforward emancipation, the film phrased the period as morally ambiguous and psychologically unsettled. Mist-soaked landscapes, dim interiors, and anxious radio broadcasts create a tonal world where hope coexists with fear and where the promise of sovereignty is shadowed by unresolved tensions. So the film's engagement with material absence is particularly striking. Like I said earlier, everyday objects from the area are not easily accessible domestically and have to be imported. And this gap in material continuity becomes part of the film's commentary, subtly pointing to the nation's uneven relationship to its own everyday past. Now, the production challenge becomes an index of historical erosion. At its narrative core, the film traces a cycle of violence back to abuse in a colonial missionary school. The choice situates independence within a longer genealogy of psychological and institutional trauma. The result is a portrait of 1960 that foregrounds ambivalence rather than celebration. And October 1 makes visible the emotional undercurrents that are often absent from official commemorations and therefore contributes alternative textures to the public imagination of the independence story. The third case study, the 76, is looking at domesticity and the affective memory of military rule. Now, Izu Ojukwu 76 reframes the 1976 coup through the intimate spaces of everyday life. By focusing on Suzanne, which was played by Rita Dominic, Suzanne was a pregnant soldier's wife and also looked at the relationships within the barracks. The film shifts the attention from military command structures to the emotional worlds of those who live through political turbulence without necessarily shaping it. This domestic orientation foregrounds fear, suspicion, and uncertainty, offering a perspective that official accounts rarely capture. The political sensitivity surrounding military representation shaped the film's aesthetics. And like I said, graphic violence is avoided in favor of off-screen sound, implication, and performance-driven tension. So this turn inwards moves the depiction of the from spectacle and towards affect. The home becomes the primary site through which political instability is experienced. So reconstructing the 1970s require improvisation. Ojukwu draws on oral testimony, family photo albums, as well as interviews with, the slain soldiers' wives, and selective reconstruction to evoke the period. The result is not strict replication, but a collage of textures that convey the emotional and social climate of the era. For viewers who did not live through the period, the film provides a way of imagining military rule through a human relational lens rather than through political chronology alone. So what are the strengths of real history? I have identified 5 strengths. The first is broader reach for historical knowledge. In Nigeria, where access to formal historical education has been uneven, film becomes one of the most widely circulating forms through which people encounter narratives of the past. Historical films travel in everyday spaces, in the homes, sometimes in the buses, markets, salons, community viewing centers, digital platforms, and so on and so forth, expanding the reach of historical imagination far beyond written text or institutional settings. Another strength is emotional and sensory access to the past. Cinema communicates history through sensations, gestures, sound, performance, atmosphere. So October 1 conveys independence as tense and unsettled. 76 captures the emotional climate surrounding military rule, while Invasion 1897 renders colonial intrusion in moral and affective terms. This sensory mode of storytelling allows viewers to grasp historical moments not only as information but as a felt experience. The third strength is reframing dominant narratives. These films complicate familiar accounts of colonialism, independence, and state power. They foreground psychological wounds, community reactions, and domestic vulnerabilities, elements often sidelined in official or elite narratives. By shifting attention towards these dimensions, the film participates in broader efforts to polarize how African histories are told. The fourth is the reanimation of cultural worlds. Historical films often bring back expressions that have receded from daily life: fashion, gestures, ritual rhythms, modes of address, and so on and so forth. So Kelani's Oleku, for example, revived the style of dress among younger generation. Other films restore interest in performative and aesthetic practices linked to specific areas. This reanimation of cultural worlds places cinema in conversation with scholarships on African popular arts as spaces of cultural renewal. And the fifth is shared symbolic references. In a diverse society, shared imagery is crucial for creating conversational ground around the past. Nigerian historical films contribute to this shared repertoire. The scenes, the tones, the motifs that people draw upon when discussing or imagining national history. They've become part of the symbolic toolkit through which communities organize historical meaning. Now, these are the strengths, but the strengths do not come without trade-offs. The very conditions that make historical cinema powerful also generate some blind spots, which I have to acknowledge. And maybe the limits are even more than the strength. Yeah, but so what I have identified 6 limits of real history. The first one is timeline compression. So feature films condense complex historical processes into manageable arcs. And this clarifies emotion, but can flatten the layered dynamics, the economic, the political, and the social dynamics that underlie events. There is character flattening. For narrative clarity, historical figures may become symbolic types or emotional anchors. This can downplay the collective dimensions of historical change and simplify complex actors. There's the aestheticized violence. So visual storytelling can often soften or stylize traumatic elements through the lighting, the music, the pacing, or camera work. The challenge is to avoid turning structural brutality into spectacle without erasing its severity. There's ideological and regional biases. Filmmakers inevitably bring personal and cultural assumptions to their work. This can privilege certain regions, classes, or gendered worldviews, shaping which histories appear central and which ones remain peripheral. We have distortions linked to material gaps. There are always problems with funding. So limitations in obtaining some of the props, locations, or some of the documentation can influence what historical worlds will be shown. And these approximations shape the visual vocabulary of the past. We also have the narrative pressure to entertain. Because they are commercial cinema, they require suspense, romance, humor, or spectacle. This demand can overshadow nuance or historical complexity, particularly in periods marked by political trauma. Yeah, I have mentioned all of these all of these limits, but then Why these limits do not undermine real history. The value of historical cinema lies not in producing exhaustive accounts, but in expanding the spaces where people encounter and debate the past. These films often open interpretative possibilities, they stimulate conversation, and they make historical experience emotionally available. Their imperfections illuminate the conditions under which the cultural work is made, conditions that themselves form part of the historical landscape. So as I begin to conclude now, I'd like to say that Nigerian historical cinema emerges in a landscape marked by uneven record, as I said earlier, political contestation and infrastructural strains. But these conditions do not simply form the background or the backdrop to filmmaking. They show how history is visualized, interpreted, and carried forward. So in this sense, real history operates as a creative and intellectual practice that draws together narrative, emotion, and cultural labor. Across the three films that we have examined, we see filmmakers confronting the gaps, the silences, and the distortion that surrounds Nigeria's past. They work with limited material, shifting permissions, and politically sensitive subjects, yet they produce works that return audiences to the emotional and social textures of colonial intrusion, independence, and military rule. These films offer the public not just stories, but ways of feeling and debating the past. Now, several intellectual threads converge here. From media infrastructural studies, we see how material conditions shape what history can look like on screen. For memory studies, we understand how film becomes one of the most accessible vehicles of collective remembrance in contemporary Nigeria. And from Walter Rodney, we retain a quiet but important reminder that reclaiming the past is ultimately about reclaiming agency, and that cultural forms matter profoundly in how societies imagine justice, continuity, and possibility. Placed alongside this perspective, Nigerian historical cinema appears not as a substitute for former archives, no, and it's not appearing as perfected accounts of past events, but it is a dynamic site where memory is continually reworked. These films circulate across class lines, across generations, and across diasporic spaces. They offer shared images through which Nigerians negotiate their historical identities. The political significance of this work is considerable. In a context where many citizens encounter key historical episodes through film, historical cinema becomes a central forum in which national memory is formed, questioned, and felt. It provides tools for imagining colonialism, independence, authoritarianism, and resistance, not only as facts, but as lived experiences. So to study Nigerian historical cinema then is to engage a broader question. And the question is, how do people remember when the structures meant to hold memory are unstable? And how do creative industries intervene in that instability? So the films discussed today are not pretending to answer these questions completely, but they answer it insistently. They revealed a cinema that refuses erasure, that refuses silence, and that insists on making the past available through feeling, through ingenuity, and through narrative craft. So real history endures because it remembers under pressure. And in doing so, it offers one of the post-colonial world's most vital cultural resource. It is a way of seeing the past, not as a closed archive, but as a living field of meaning, continually rebuilt through imagination and through film. And yeah, this is me with the filmmakers. I've been following them around a lot. Probably they are tired of me now. Yeah. So we have Kunle Afolayan, in the middle is Ojukwu, and finally Lancelot Imaswin. Yeah, thank you very much.